Thank you very much for joining and listening to this week's talk on the Sedra of Vayera, and we are dedicating this learning to the safe and speedy release of all of the hostages in Gaza and the safety and success of all of the soldiers in the IDF as they carry out their missions with God's help to protect the people of Israel and the land of Israel. And this week's Sedra of Vayera has many outstanding lessons, conversations, events. And perhaps the most outstanding in people's minds is the event that is described in chapter 22 in the last chapter of the Sedra, which is the event of akeida Yitzchak, the binding of Yitzchak. And I think as we question, because we've been brought up to call it the binding of Isaac, the akeida Yitzchak, and it's something that I never really questioned, because out of all of the actions that had to be performed for this particular challenge, this nisayon that Avraham Avinu was given by Hashem, it is actually the only time in all of the 10 which are calculated by various commentators, and it is the only time that the word nisa, the root to test, is used, or to challenge is used. And we are wanting to know why this word akeida has been singled out, the concept of binding. At first thought, we could argue that actually it was the least exceptional and demanding of all of the other actions that had to be carried out as Avram goes along on this mission. And I think that we can find a few reasons why actually it is such an appropriate and meaningful title, and it is also something that has been called akedas Yitzchak since the Talmud. It's referenced as such in earlier pieces of Gemara in the Talmud, and in the Medrash as well. It is referred to as the akeida. So this is not something that was a later developing thought. This was something that from the early chapters and references of the oral law is referred to as akedas Yitzchak. And I think that if we think chronologically, that the binding of Yitzchak, because although it's called one of the tests or challenges of Avraham Avinu, it really was Yitzchak who was bound. And in a way, Yitzchak had to prove himself, because his stepbrother Yishmael, we learned at the end of last week's Sedra, had his circumcision when he was 13 years old. When Avraham Avinu is given the command to perform bris milah, circumcision, on himself, he also carries out bris milah on all of his household, including Yishmael. Yishmael is 13 years old at the time, and that is considered an adult. So for an adult to willingly submit himself to undergo what would be a very painful procedure at that point was a great challenge and a merit for Yishmael. And Yitzchak was 8 days old, and that is not the same level of challenge and pain for an 8-day-old baby as for a 13-year-old young man. And in a way, the akedas Yitzchak, the actual binding of Yitzchak, was when Yitzchak was 37 years old at the time, according to the rabbis, and this was Yitzchak's opportunity to show that his mesirat nefesh, his willingness to follow the command of Hashem, whatever it involved, then that was something that superseded the meritorious deed of Yishmael having the circumcision at the age of 13. So this is perhaps why we're focusing on the binding of Yitzchak. And the next reason that we can observe is that Yitzchak was very passive throughout the journey towards Mount Moriah, as their father and son are walking together and they're having a conversation, but there's also moments of silence as the reality of the situation is probably dawning on Yitzchak as they go on this mission together. And it is Yitzchak's, he is, at that point, he is very passive. But when Avraham Avinu is actually binding Yitzchak, when he is tying his, according to one opinion, tying his legs together and then his hands together. And with that, Yitzchak becomes more active, that he is not resisting, as things become so obvious that they can no longer be squashed down and given some other reason, that the reality is just very stark in front of Yitzchak of what is happening. And at that point that he's not resisting, and according to the Medrash, actually, he is saying to his father, Abraham Avinu, bind me tighter, just in case inadvertently I resist as you are binding, and the knife slips, and that will render the korban invalid, and I don't want that to happen. So with the act of the actual akeida, Yitzchak becomes an active partner in this, in the whole challenge of the akeida. And we talk about binding and the ties that bind. As the father and son, Avraham Avinu and Yitzchak Avinu, are going together on this mission, they are being bound together. They are connecting in a way that they have not connected before, and they are also connecting with Hashem. And in this way, this Akedas Yitzchak is bringing them to a level of closeness and connection that they have not had before. And it is in that way that we can see that the Akedah is such a perfect title. And it is also important to remember that with the transmission from Abraham to Yitzchak, that this was the first of the challenges that involved Abraham passing on his qualities, his value systems, his belief, when his son willingly accepted his role in the challenge of Akedas Yitzchak. So all of these things connected, bound up with the actual binding, this makes the title of Akedah so very appropriate. And we can see how this continues to bind us. And when we look at the Haftorah of this week's Sedra as well, and the Haftorah is from the second book of Malachim, second book of Kings, and it talks about Elisha the prophet and how he saves the son of the Shunammite woman who was in the field and suddenly gets a terrible headache and collapses and dies. And he is summoned by the mother of this child, the Shunammite woman, and Elisha comes and he prays and davens, and then he lies down on top of the child and gives mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And the Radak asks the question, why does he have to do this physical act as well? Why is prayer alone not sufficient? And two answers are given. The first is that Hashem wants us to be partners in the things that we do. Everything we acknowledge and we see the cause, the first cause of that is Hashem, and we acknowledge that. But that does not absolve us from making our own efforts. They are an important part of our relationship with our Creator, with the talents and the opportunities that He has given us. And so it's very important that we do our efforts to the best of our abilities. And the other reason that's given is that when we are davening, when we are hoping that a person has a complete healing, it is an important part of the mitzvah, of the halachic requirement, that if we can be physically present, and that will also, that physical closeness will help the refuah as well. So these two are important reasons why Elisha had to not just daven, not just pray, but also do some physical action as well. And this it's pointed out by Rabbi Dr. Kenneth Brander in a blog on the Haftorah, and he says we have more than 12,000 injured soldiers and civilians since the Simchas Torah of the previous year. And when we think about how we can bring about, how we can do our efforts to bring about refuah shalema. This is such an important part, such an important mitzvah for us at this point in time. And these are truly the ties that bind us. And I think that this is a very deep way that we can connect to the themes of the akeida that we read about in this week's Sedra and really feel its relevance to us at this point in time. Please God, we should merit that everybody should be healed and our prayers should be answered, and wishing everybody Shabbat Shalom.